Hey everybody, we're back and talking about David. Um, we're left with a situation where Saul is jealous of David, and it's a matter of Saul being so jealous that he would throw spears at him, and David would have to leave the palace. And it got to the point where Jonathan warned David, his friend, that his dad was going to kill him. Now, I just want to mention something about Jonathan. Now, Jonathan is in line with the throne from his father, but yet why then would he defend this guy who has a threat to the throne? And I think it's pretty clear that their friendship was more important to him than the possibility of him getting the throne someday. That says a lot about how friendship was more important than his livelihood or his power. So really hats off to Jonathan. So David is on the run. He's maybe like 18, 19. He's been in a number of battles since he's been, and he's kind of gained some credibility with the army and stuff. And his brothers rally around him, and they escape Saul, who is now pursuing them. And as they go, a number of different soldiers defect, and they go with David's little group, his little band of merry men. And Saul pursues them and pursues them. And to make a long story short, he tries to kill him several times, and David eventually escapes to the Philistines, this rival to the Israelites, and says that, "Hey, has been hunting me for a couple years now, and I need a place to be able to kind of settle. So can I come and be with you guys, and I will join you?" Now, the Philistines and their 10 kings were super nervous about this because David had defeated them time and time again. And so now this warrior that they were afraid of now wants to join them. Is there a trick here? So they got together and they said, well, okay. So what we'll do is uh, we're going to leave David and his soldiers behind to defend the 10 cities. And we'll use all of our soldiers in one final battle to go and defeat Saul and all these Israelites. And so they do that, and David says, "Fine, we'll just stay back and we'll deal with these Philistine cities." And so off the Philistines go, and they head out to defend or to attack the Israelites. And this battle rages on, and the Philistines are winning, and the Philistines are winning. In the meantime, David is, these Philistine cities are completely unguarded, and he's not really committed to being a Philistine. So he takes and burns and destroys all the Philistine cities. So they have nothing to come back to. Then he turns his soldiers and he goes and flanks the Philistine army. And while they are attacking and almost defeating the Israelite army, from the rear, David and his group come and attack them. Now, in the meantime, the Philistines have almost completely defeated the Israelites, and Saul sees that there can be no victory, and so he falls on his own sword and he kills himself. Jonathan is killed in the battle as well, and what ends up happening is David entering the fray turns the tide. They defeat the Philistines, and David is taken back to the palace and made king. Um, and so this is kind of, and David becomes the next king. Um, he unites the land. Everybody kind of rallies around him, and he establishes Jerusalem as the government and worship center. And it becomes known as the City of David, even to this day. Jerusalem is known as the City of David. Now, a couple of things that his big issue was running into the problem of adultery. Now, he had a general named Uriah, and who he lived close to the palace. And Uriah had a beautiful wife named Bathsheba. And while the soldiers were off fighting, the king was there, and he looked over his wall and he saw Bathsheba, and he was pretty taken with her. And he was already married himself, and he took Bathsheba, and they had a little bit of an affair. And she comes down pregnant, and so he's like, "What am I going to do?" So he calls Uriah back from the war and says, "Why don't you spend a weekend with your wife just to relax because you're doing such a great job?" Excuse me. And Uriah's like, "Sir, I appreciate it, but my soldiers are back there, and I wouldn't want to leave them, so I can't spend any more time. I got to get back to the." No, why don't you spend? No, sir, I got to go back. And David's like, "Okay." And in a really bad decision, David writes a note to Uriah's commanding officer, um, stamps it and seals it and gives it to Uriah to give to his commanding officer. So Uriah goes back to the fray. There's no way that they can kind of convince Uriah that maybe the baby's his because he won't stay with his wife Bathsheba. And so the note that the commanding officer opens up and says, "Put Uriah to the front." And so this man gives Uriah the order. Uriah goes to the front, and eventually he dies. And so Bathsheba now, so David had Uriah killed so as to take Bathsheba into his own palace, which is super super bad, right? And so the prophet Nathan comes to David and says, "Hey, I have to tell you something that's going on in your kingdom. There was a man who had one sheep, and his next door neighbor had 100 sheep. And the man who had 100 sheep looked over at that one sheep and said, 'I want that sheep.' And and then he went and he killed the man and took the sheep. And David thought this was a real story and was like, 'Who is this man? He deserves to die.' And Nathan's like, 'The man is you, man.' And David's like, he realizes that it's about him stealing Bathsheba from Uriah. And he's like, oh, so like they lose that baby. But they eventually have another baby, and this baby is Solomon, and he is going to take control after David. Now Solomon's a young kid, and one of the story goes that he's young, and it's getting close to where he's going to take over as king. And God comes to him and says to him, Solomon, what gift would you like me to give you as you soon become king? And Solomon says, "Well, I could ask for anything, but I think because if I'm going to have to take care of your people, Lord, I am going to ask for wisdom to guide them well." And God's like, "Yeah, that's not bad, bro. You could have asked for jewels, you could have asked for wealth, you could have asked for your enemies, to be in the palm of your hand. You could have asked for land. You could have asked anything, and you asked for wisdom. That's pretty good. That's wise. So I'm gonna make you more wise than anybody has ever been, and I'm gonna raise you all of the wealth and all of the land and all of your enemies under your foot." So that was a cool story about Solomon. And so Solomon gets this great wisdom. And there are lots of tales about wisdom. So much so that people from all over come and hear the wisdom of Solomon, like even including the Queen of Ethiopia, who comes all this way. Now, the one of the stories that is best typifies this is two women come and they have a baby and they ask Solomon to make a judgment. The one woman gets up there and says, "All right, we both had babies, and they were both in the same nursery. And one night, this woman's baby died, and she came in and switched the dead baby with my baby, and so now she's claiming that this is her baby." And the other woman's like, "This is exactly the opposite. It's actually her that is the one who switched the babies. So you have to decide whose baby is this." So, I mean, it's a tough predicament to be in. And Solomon says, "Well, bring me a sword and we'll cut the baby in half and you can each have half." And the one woman's like, "Good," you know. And the other woman's like, "No, no, have her take the baby. Don't have the baby cut in half." And right then and there, Solomon knew that the true mother would never allow the baby to be killed. And so the woman who wanted to give her baby up to keep it alive was given the baby as hers. It's a cool story of wisdom. Now, Solomon's problem was that he became too infatuated with all these women, and all these women were allowed to come to the palace and have all the gods and goddesses that they wanted to worship. And Solomon would go and hang out with all these wives, and he would worship these idols, and that was what was the big problem. And God said, "Listen, all this idol worship, I'm not going to take the kingdom from you, but I will from your son." And we'll see what happens next.